Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is a bit of a winter special as we will be talking about Little Women. It is a huge classic, but it was actually a first-time read for me, and I was very much surprised when I got to the end of the book and it didn't finish. The story wasn't finished. This is apparently not a standalone book. So after a bit of digging, I discovered that this is actually a trilogy, but not officially. That was a bit unclear. Let's just say I was quite perturbed. Mainly because I hadn't planned on doing a multi-part video series on Little Women, and I don't like surprises. But anyway, here we are, and I am determined to make the best of it. But before we get started, just a quick reminder, if you really enjoy these kinds of videos, it would mean a lot to me if you would consider subscribing. It is a great way to show me that you enjoyed them and want to see more from me. But yeah, without further ado, why don't you make yourself comfortable with a nice hot beverage and let's get into it. Little Women follows the March sisters in Massachusetts, more specifically sisters Meg, Jo, Beth and Amy during 1 year of their lives. The story starts at Christmas and the girls' father have just left them to go and fight in the Civil War, so the time period is early 1860s. But the girls still have their mother to help guide them through the challenges of life. Before the war, the family were financially comfortable, but with their father gone, the two eldest sisters had to work for a living. Meg, who was the eldest, was 16 and worked as a governess, and Jo, who was 15, worked as a caretaker for their wealthy great-aunt. But this is probably the only thing that these two girls have in common. Overall, Meg is a very pretty young woman who loves luxury and being a proper lady. And Jo is a writer and a bookworm, as well as a clumsy tomboy. The two younger sisters have quite particular personalities as well. Beth, who's 13, is a shy and peaceful introvert who loves music, and Amy, who's only 12 and therefore the youngest, is pretty spoiled and self-important, and she likes art and painting. So the two eldest sisters, Meg and Jo, are invited to a New Year's Eve party in the village that year. Meg is very excited and wants to look her best, whereas Jo was told to stand by the wall the whole evening as her dress had a big burn mark in the back. It is at this party that Jo meets Theodore, also called Laurie, a 15-year-old boy who lives next door to them with his grumpy old grandfather, Mr. Lawrence. Laurie and Jo are quite similar in personality. They're both adventurous young rascals and they quickly become friends. So Little Women doesn't have a plot in the traditional sense, but rather a series of events that help the sisters grow as people. Shortly after the March sisters began hanging out with Laurie, the second youngest sister, Beth, had to overcome her fear of Laurie's grandfather as she so wanted to play the beautiful piano they had at their house. Conquering her shyness and fear, she eventually goes there and asks if she can use the piano to practice, and the grumpy old man finds her so endearing, he eventually ends up giving her a small piano as a gift. And thus Laurie's grumpy grandfather became a friend of the family as well, and Beth learned that there is much to gain from conquering your fears. Next one up is youngest sister Amy. One day she tells elder sisters Meg and Jo about the new thing at school, some popular candy that the children give each other between lessons, and that she is in great debt to her classmates as she never has any money to buy candy with. What she failed to mention, however, was that the teacher had forbidden candy at school. So Meg gives her some money and she buys a lot of candy with it and brings it with her the next day. Unfortunately for Amy, the teacher finds out about it and decides to make an example of her by making her throw out all the candy from the window and then striking her in front of the whole class. This has her sisters very angry, and her mother ends up taking her out of the school. She literally doesn't have to go there anymore. So the lesson here was probably that breaking the rules has consequences. But in Amy's case, the only thing she learned was that breaking the rules gives her special treatment. As is shown more clearly in the next event, when Meg and Joe are invited to the theatre with Laurie, Amy is horribly jealous as she's not allowed to join. She makes a huge scene, crying and screaming and demanding to be allowed to go with them. But Joe is resolute, saying that Laurie only got tickets for her and Meg, and so they leave Amy behind. And when they got back from the theatre, Amy had a surprise waiting for Joe. In her spoiled, unfounded rage, she had decided to burn a manuscript that Joe had been working on. Remember, she's a writer. And Amy was quite proud of this act of vengeance, until Joe's furious reaction made her realize the severity of her actions. She begs Joe for forgiveness, but Joe rightfully refuses. As a writer myself, if anyone had knowingly destroyed a manuscript of mine that I didn't have any copies of, I would likely never speak to them again. Just saying. I think it's quite clear to everyone at this point that I am not a fan of Amy, but it was in this section that my hatred for this character reached a whole new level. But of course, Amy doesn't receive any punishment for her behavior, but thinks that if she nags Joe enough, she will eventually forgive her. So one day, Joe and the neighbor boy Laurie go out ice skating together, and Amy follows them. Joe notices her behind them, but rightfully ignores her. She is not ready to forgive and wants to be left alone. That is when Amy skates over a thin patch of ice, which then breaks and she falls through it. Joe and Laurie hurry over there to help her, and they manage to get her out of the water quite quickly. Regardless, everyone is now pampering poor Amy by the fire, and Joe even forgives her as she had been hit by the fear of losing her while they were on bad terms, as any normal person probably would. So this ended up being more of a lesson for Joe not to carry grudges, even though she had all the right to be angry in my opinion, but I will let it go now. Let's move on from my annoyance of Amy and talk about the next life lesson. This time it is the eldest sister Meg who is invited to spend 2 weeks with some wealthy friends of hers. They dress her up in fancy clothes and accessories, and she gets to drink champagne and dance with boys at parties. At one of these parties, he runs into Laurie, and he's quite surprised at seeing her all made up like that. He makes some remarks that causes Meg to feel ashamed, and this is supposed to teach her a lesson about vanity and reaching beyond your station. Skipping ahead now to the beginning of summer, and the sisters are hanging out with Laurie and some other friends of his. They all have a good time playing croquet and having picnic out on the meadow, and Meg talks quite a bit with a Mr. Brooke, who was Laurie's tutor, and they seem to be hitting it off quite well. Sometime later, Joe managed to get one of her stories published in the local paper, and as she's walking alone with Laurie and talking about this, he tells her that Meg has a secret admirer. This upsets Joe, as she doesn't like to think about Meg growing up and eventually getting married. Some more time pass and it's now autumn, and the March family receive a troubling telegram saying that their father was very ill at a hospital in Washington. Mrs. March decides to go there at once, and Mr. Brooke offered to go with her as it was unsafe for women to be traveling alone. Joe really wants to contribute some money for her father's recovery, so she ends up selling her hair. Apparently she had really long, beautiful hair, and now she had a boy's haircut, and this was a really significant and bold move. So the sisters are all really worried now, but they all do their best to keep things going in their mother's absence. Meg is taking the role of the caretaker for the family, and Beth went to help a poor family in town that had sick children. It is then revealed that those children had scarlet fever, a disease that was quite dangerous at the time, and the youngest child even died in Beth's arms. Quite horrible. Both Meg and Joe had had scarlet fever when they were younger, but Beth and Amy hadn't, and Beth began feeling ill pretty soon after coming home. So she's put to bed, and Amy is sent off to temporarily live with their great aunt to protect her from getting the disease. Amy, however, was anything but thrilled at this idea because their aunt was so severe, and all she can think of is herself and her own comfort and amusement. She did eventually agree to go, but only because Laurie promised he would come and visit her every single day. So Beth is getting more and more sick, far more so than anyone had anticipated. The house was really subdued as Meg, Joe, and the housekeeper did their best to take care of Beth and made sure that there was always someone at her bedside. Eventually, the local doctor told the girls that it would be best to get their mother back from Washington. But Amy, of course, was suffering a lot too. At their aunt's house, she had to deal with house chores and cleaning, and she had to deal with her aunt's parrot who was rude to her. She was miserable indeed, but Laurie did keep his promise to come by and amuse her every day. So their aunt, whom they only call Aunt March, I don't think we learn her first name, she is quite wealthy, and her maid let slip to Amy that the old lady was planning on giving her a valuable ring as a reward if Amy behaved well during her stay. And the thought of this reward certainly did the trick. Amy was a lot more compliant after that. But to her credit, she did also have some important insights regarding death and how to live your life with goodness, as you never know when it will all be over. Thankfully, their mother, Mrs. March, arrived back home just in time for Beth to pull through and start feeling better. That night, Mrs. March talks about Mr. Brooke and how much of a gentleman he's been in helping her take care of their father in Washington. And that the reason why is because he's in love with Meg, who is now 17, by the way. Joe, as we know, dislikes the idea and talks to Laurie about it, who, for some reason, decides to prank Meg and sends a love letter to her that he pretends is from Mr. Brooke. Meg is mortified when she finds out about this, and Mrs. March and Joe both give Laurie a good scolding. But Joe notices a change in Meg after this. She's distracted and embarrassed when spoken to, as if pulled out of some kind of pleasant daydream. Christmas is coming up now, and the family gets a huge surprise when Mr. Brooke arrives at the house with their long-missed father, who was finally well enough to travel. Mr. March is thrilled to be back with his family and recounts all the life lessons the girls have learned over the past year. He is proud of Meg for being such a hard worker, of Joe for having become a strong and proper young woman and not so wild anymore, and Beth for being less shy, and of Amy for being less selfish. Then it's time for Mr. Brooke to announce his intentions, and soon thereafter he reveals his feelings to Meg as they have a moment alone. He wants her to marry him at some point when they're ready. Meg runs off feeling nervous and unsure, but a timely visit from Aunt March telling her not to marry Mr. Brooke as he's too poor made her decide in his favor, and she accepted him. And everyone is happy for them, except for Joe. The end. If you think that ending was a bit abrupt, then I would agree. It was only at this point that I realized that this wasn't a standalone book. So, let's talk about this. I'm kind of struggling to decide whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that I didn't look anything up about this book prior to reading it. Throughout the process of reading, I went back and forth a lot on what I thought this book even was. At first, I thought it was a charming novel that took its time to introduce its characters properly before the story started, but then I was nearly at the midpoint of the book and there was still no story in sight. And I was, to be perfectly honest, a little bit bored. So that's when I changed my way of thinking and concluded that this was a children's book written as a collection of mini-stories aimed towards young girls to inspire them to be good individuals. And then I reached the ending and I looked up the sequel and found that the characters are all grown up there, facing the struggles of adult life. So that didn't quite fit my previous conviction either. As you can probably tell, I was a bit perplexed. What I can say with at least some certainty is that Little Women is a coming-of-age story, even if it isn't a structured story with a beginning, middle, and end. The March sisters all struggle with their respective flaws throughout the year that this book takes place, and following their growth as characters was quite nice. I do appreciate some good character work. So I thought I would go through each sister one by one and discuss their personal journeys. So let's get into that. At the start of the book, Meg is perceived as a bit stuck up. She seems to care a lot about being proper and ladylike. For instance, when she and Joe went to that New Year's Eve party in the beginning, she was quite stern with Joe as she had a more disheveled appearance and I suppose a more casual attitude in general. Meg told Joe to look at her eyebrows. If Joe was about to do something that Meg disapproved of, she would raise her eyebrows to indicate a firm no. I quite like that Meg's eyebrows comes back at multiple places in the book. It was such a quirky detail. But nonetheless, it showed that Meg wanted to fit in with the other young ladies in her peer group, despite the fact that her family had fallen on hard times and were not part of high society. She puts so much emphasis on her appearance, her clothes and accessories, and you often hear her express a desire for more luxurious things. At one point in the book, she even says that her greatest wish in life is to get a wealthy husband and a big house with lots of servants so that she won't have to work herself. In many cases, this would be seen as a negative trait, but Meg is a really sweet girl at the core, and despite thinking that she wanted luxury, she always put others before herself. When she was visiting those wealthier friends of hers, she got a glimpse of what it was like to be in high society, and it had a dark side to it. She overheard people gossiping about her and telling lies about her family to sort of make her look better than she actually was, and she was rightfully horrified by this. There was a sense of fakery about the whole thing, and it made her feel uneasy. This didn't deter her entirely from wanting a life of luxury in the future, though, but it was a humbling experience for sure. In the end, she does end up falling in love with Mr. Brooke for his kindness and not his money, because he didn't have any. I don't know what happens in part 2 of the story. He might gain some wealth there, but the important thing here is that she accepted him despite his low prospects. The circumstances there are quite interesting because Aunt March had come to visit just after Mr. Brooke had made his offer, and Meg was unsure of what to do. She was then faced with the thing that she had always feared, the disapproval of her wealthier peers. Aunt March said outright that she would disinherit Meg if she accepted this man, and this awful comment from her own relative made Meg decide to accept him. I'm a bit conflicted about this though, as I personally don't see how she had enough time with Mr. Brooke for me to buy into this relationship. I think Mr. Brooke decided on Meg because she was pretty and had a sweet temper, and Meg chose him simply because he showed interest. She is a 17-year-old girl given attention from the opposite sex for the first time. It's only natural for her to feel flattered. But in the 1800s, I suppose these were reasons enough to get married. But we'll see how this evolves in the next part. Jo is, in my opinion, the most interesting out of the four sisters. And not just because she's a writer, like yours truly, but because she has such a strong personality with many interesting sides to it. She is indeed a writer and a bookworm, but she's also very extroverted and quite sassy. I'm not saying that all writers are introverts, but more often than not, we are, which is why a character like this is so refreshing. At the start of the book, Jo refers to herself as the man in the family in her father's absence. She enjoys dressing up like a boy, dislikes anything that has to do with being a girl, and she's quite feisty and hot-tempered. She feels things very strongly, and this temper of hers often gets her into arguments with friends and family. So throughout the book, Jo had to work on her temper and try to suppress her anger. But another change was also her slowly accepting a more female identity. There was less talk about being the man in the family, and she even began dressing more proper. She was never vain, not in the way that Meg was, but she took better care of her appearance and clothes. In the end, when she sold her hair to make money for their father, she ended up grieving the loss of that long, beautiful hair, which shows her as more comfortable with the typically female characteristics. I have this theory that Jo possessed many traits that were more encouraged in men at the time. She had ambition, she was headstrong, driven and confident. And I'm not saying that women weren't all of these things as well, only that women were usually encouraged to be more gentle, mellow, and compliant. I think you know what I mean. And because Jo displayed those male-coded traits, she began identifying with this group a lot more. So what I think happened during the year of Little Women is that she begins to mature a bit. She's only 16 at the end of the book, so she still has some way to go. But she subconsciously understands that she doesn't have to fall into one or the other, the male or the female. She begins accepting who she is as a person and therefore starts to carve her own path. And I'm curious to see where it takes her in the next book. Again, this is just my theory. I'm sure there are plenty of them out there when it comes to Jo. Feel free to share your own thoughts in the comments if you have anything to add there. Oh, Beth. Sweet, darling Beth. She is actually the sister I identify with the most. It's not her love of music, as I don't play any instruments, but rather her crippling shyness and introverted nature. As much as I would love to be a Jo, I am definitely a Beth in that regard. But there's more to Beth than just shyness and a love of music. She has a selflessness and sweetness to her character that I find so endearing. She's the ultimate caretaker, one could say. She doesn't go to school as she's too shy, so she learns from home while also helping the housekeeper with the daily chores. She loves to care for others, and when asked what her dreams of the future were, she said that she wanted to take care of her mother and father in their old age. I looked really hard, but I could not find an arc for Beth. She had very few challenges during the book, the main one being overcoming her fear of Laurie's grandfather. And while that encounter might have made her a bit less shy, She was still the same Beth at the end of the book. I can't help but wonder if, back in those days, the expectations were lower for people who suffered from social anxiety, which is what crippling shyness is. It's social anxiety. That instead of supporting these individuals in getting out of their comfort zones a bit, they simply accepted that this is how they are. I sometimes got that impression as I was reading, and I have mixed feelings on this. On the one hand, I love how accepting they are of Beth. On the other, I wonder if Beth might have grown a little more if she'd had more support in that regard. Although I know for a fact, as a person with social anxiety, I don't appreciate when other people decide when it's time for me to grow and therefore push me out of my comfort zone and ignoring my boundaries. It can do more harm than good. And I never saw Beth's family do this, which is a good thing. But there weren't any expectations from her to even try on her own either. It's definitely a double-edged sword kind of situation. So Beth had this special relationship with Jo. Jo was her protector in a way. As we know, Jo is of a strong character. It would be natural for her to want to protect those who cannot protect themselves. But Beth, being the caretaker that she is, has her own way of doing this. She has a collection of dolls that she dresses and takes out on walks and stuff. And these dolls are very important to her. They're like her own little extended family. I think it's very comforting to see that a person who's usually under the wing of other more confident people in their lives can feel like they can be protectors too. And I like to see this as Beth practicing for adulthood when she might have to take on more challenges. Or at least, that's what I hope. I'm sorry to all the Amy fans out there, I just keep bashing this poor 12-year-old. But I promise I will give her credit where credit is due. So, where to start with Amy? Her biggest flaw that she was working on throughout the year was her selfishness. And she had quite a few instances where she was confronted with this, the biggest one being the time when she burned Jo's manuscript. She realized her mistake and gained some insight through the experience, which is a good thing. But then I struggled to understand why she caused such a scene when Beth got sick and she had to move to Aunt March's house. She had displayed some growth and insight before this, and it all just came crashing down at the slightest inconvenience. I just wanted to shake her. Your sister is sick with a dangerous disease. They are sending you away to protect you. So, Amy's most significant time of growth is definitely the time she spent at Aunt March's. She was forced to do some proper chores and was given strict routine for the first time in her life. And I think this did her good. And she does do a lot of thinking here and eventually turning her thoughts away from herself and towards Beth, who is seriously ill at this point. She had a moment of insight here that I thought was really powerful, and that was that if Beth died, so many people would mourn and miss her because she was so sweet and lovable to anyone who met her. And when Amy looked at herself, she did not see the same lovable nature as people saw in Beth. That if she died, people would not think of her in the same way they would Beth. I do think that this is quite deep, and it's understandable that it would inspire Amy to become a better person. And I genuinely hope it works, because otherwise I will have major problems getting through the next book. So overall, I think the main strength of this novel are the characters. They are so unique, charming, and have a lot of small details that make them feel like real people. The main weakness for me was that it's only half a story. I didn't have a sense of direction as I was reading it. It also felt a little bit preachy at times, and maybe that's because I'm reading this for the first time as an adult. But I can imagine this as perfect bedtime reading for younger children, as it has some playful parts where the reader is supposed to feel included when the girls are playing, and as well as being immersive enough to let a young reader learn vicariously through their experiences and mistakes. So yeah, it will be interesting to see how it continues. I would very much like to know what all of you think of Little Women, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. Also, if you enjoy my videos, then please give me a like and hit that subscribe button. It really does make my day whenever I see a new subscriber coming in. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you back next time.